Alrighty. Since I don't know, there's some weird stuff going on, so I am going to share this out real quick. Let me just copy and paste this to here. Guess what? I'm gonna share it there. No, I should do a new one. Sorry, the first part of these videos are me being very, very technologically unsavvy. So, oh man. Yeah. It's a good time as always. Hope you're having a good day. I'm having a good day. So far, so good. And here we go. The link is posted. So, and I gotta put in my hashtags. Reading time. I don't have a better name other than Kyle's Reading Time, but you know what? It works, I guess, because that's what I'm doing. I'm Kyle. I'm reading, and it is the time for me to do that. So I think last we left off, or actually I don't think I checked beforehand because I didn't want to go into this acting like I didn't know. That didn't happen. So we were on chapter 11, which is entitled "The Binding of Iron." Hey Dylan, what's up? Glad you could join. Thanks for making it. I'm just getting started, just getting kicked off. So I'm going to try to keep that as quiet as possible. I don't know how much that shows up or how much you can hear the buzzing of the phone, but let's just get started. Chapter 11, The Binding of Iron. I sat in the back of Abinthy's wagon. It was a wonderful place for me, home to 100 bottles and bundles, saturated with 1,000 smells. To my young mind, it was usually more fun than a tinkerer's cart, but not today. It had rained heavily the night before, and the road was a thick morass of mud. Since the troop was not on any particular schedule, we had decided to wait for a day or two to give the roads time to dry. It was a fairly common occurrence, and it happened to fall at the perfect time for Ben to further my education. So I sat at the wooden work table in the back of Ben's wagon and chafed at wasting the day listening to him lecture me about things I already understood. My thoughts must have been apparent because Abinthy sighed and sat down beside me. Not quite what you expected, eh? I relaxed a bit, knowing his tone meant a temporary reprieve from the lecture. He gathered up a handful of the iron drabs that were sitting on the table and clinked them together thoughtfully in his hand. He looked at me. Did you learn to juggle all at once? 5 balls at a time? Knives too? I flushed a bit at the memory. Tripp hadn't even let me try 3 balls at first. He'd made me juggle 2. I'd even dropped them a couple of times. I told Ben so. Right, Ben said. Master of tricks, and you get to learn another. I expected him to stand up and start back into the lesson, but he didn't. Instead, he held out the handful of iron drabs. What do you know about these? He clattered them together in his hand. In what respect? I asked. Physically, chemically, historically? Historically, he grinned. Astound me with your grasp of historical minutiae, Elir. I had asked him what Elir meant once. He claimed it meant wise one. But I had my doubts from the way his mouth had quirked when he said it. A long time ago, the people who... How long ago? I frowned at him in mock severity. Roughly 2,000 years ago, the nomadic folk who roamed the foothills around the Shalda Mountains were brought together under one chieftain. What was his name? Heldred. His sons was Heldim and Heldar. Would you like his entire lineage, or should I get to the point? I glowered at him. Sorry, sir. Ben sat up straight in his seat and assumed such an aspect of rapt attention that we both broke into grins. I started again. Heldred eventually controlled the foothills around the Shalda. This meant that he controlled the mountains themselves. They started to plant crops, their nomadic lifestyle was abandoned, and they slowly began to... Get to the point, Abinthy asked. He tossed the drabs onto the floor in front of me. I ignored him as best as I could. They controlled the only plentiful and easily accessible source of metal for a great distance, and soon they were the most skilled workers of those metals as well. They exploited this advantage and gained a great deal of wealth and power. Until this point, barter was the most common method of trade. Some larger cities coined their own currency, but outside those cities, the money was only worth the weight of the metal. Bars of metal were better for bartering, but full bars of metal were inconvenient to carry. Ben gave me his best bored student face. The effect was only slightly inhibited by the fact that he had burned his eyebrows off again about 2 days ago. "You're not going to go into the merits of representational currency, are you?" I took a deep breath and resolved not to pester Ben so much when he was lecturing me. The no longer nomads called the Sealdom. I don't know what that word is. The no longer nomads called the Chaldom by now. Man, I don't know what that word is. I should have watched that video again. Let's see. Cealdim. I don't want to say Sealdom. Sealdom. We'll go with that. Sealdom. The no longer nomads called the Sealdom by now were the first to establish a standardized currency. By cutting one of these small bars into 5 pieces, you get 5 drabs. I began to piece 2 rows of 5 drabs each together to illustrate my point. They resembled little ingots of metal. 10 drabs are the same as a copper jot, 10 jots. Good enough, Ben broke in, startling me. So these 2 drabs, he held a pair out for my inspection, could have come from the same bar, right? Actually, they probably cast them individually. I trailed off under a glare. Sure. So there's something still connecting them, right? He gave me the look again. I didn't really agree, but knew better than to interrupt. Right. He set them both on the table, so when you move one, the other should move, right? I agreed for the sake of argument, then reached out to move one. But Ben stopped my hand, shaking his head. You've got to remind them first. You've got to convince them, in fact. He brought out a bowl and decanted a slow blob of pine pitch into it. He dipped one of the drabs into the pitch and stuck the other one to it, spoke several words I didn't recognize, and slowly pulled the bits apart, strands of pitch stretching between them. He set one on the table, keeping the other in his hand. Then he muttered something else and relaxed. He raised his hand and the drab on the table mimicked the motion. He danced his hand around and the brown piece of iron bobbed in the air. He looked from me to the coin. The law of sympathy is one of the most basic parts of magic. It states that more similar two objects are, the greater the sympathetic link. The greater the link, the more easily they influence each other. Your definition is circular. He set down the coin. His lecturer's facade gave way to a grin as he tried with marginal success to wipe the pitch off of his hand with a rag. He thought for a while. Seems pretty useless, doesn't it? I gave a hesitant nod. Trick questions were fairly common around lesson time. Would you rather learn how to call the wind? His eyes danced at me. He murmured a word and the canvas ceiling of the wagon rustled around us. I felt a grin capture my face. Wolfish. Too bad, Elier. His grin was wolfish too, and savage. You need to learn your letters before you can write. You need to learn the fingerings on the strings before you play and sing. He pulled out a piece of paper and jotted a couple of words on it. The trick is in holding the alar firm in your mind. You need to believe they are connected. You need to know they are. He handed me the paper. Here is the phonetic pronunciation. It's called the sympathetic binding of parallel motion. Practice. He looked even more lupine than ever, old and grizzled with no eyebrows. He left to wash his hands. I cleared my mind using Heart of Stone. Soon I was floating on a sea of dispassionate calm. I stuck the 2 bits of metal together with pine pitch. I fixed in my mind the alar, the riding crop belief, and that the 2 drabs were connected. I said the words, pulled the coins apart, spoke the last word, and waited. No rush of power, no flash of hot or cold, no radiant beam of light struck me. I was rather disappointed, at least as disappointed as I could be in the Heart of Stone. I lifted the coin in my hand, and the coin on the table lifted itself in a similar fashion. It was magic, there was no doubt about that. But I felt rather underwhelmed. I had been expecting... I don't know what I'd been expecting. It wasn't this. The rest of the day was spent experimenting with the simple sympathetic binding Abinthy had taught me. I learned that almost anything could be bound together. an iron drab and a silver talent, a stone and a piece of fruit, 2 bricks, a clod of earth, and one of the donkeys. It took me about 2 hours to figure out that the pine pitch wasn't necessary. When I asked him, Ben admitted that it was merely an aid for concentration. I think he was surprised that I figured it out without being told. Let me sum up sympathy very quickly, since you will probably never need to have anything other than a rough comprehension of how these things work. First, energy cannot be created or destroyed. When you're lifting one drab and the other rises off the table, the one in your hand feels as heavy as if you're lifting both, because in fact, you are. That's in theory. In practice, it feels like you're lifting 3 drabs. No sympathetic link is perfect. The more dissimilar the items, the more energy is lost. Think of it as a leaky aqueduct leading to a water wheel. A good sympathetic link has very few leaks, and most of the energy is used. A bad link is full of holes. Very little of the effort you put into it goes toward what you want it to do. For instance, I tried linking a piece of chalk to a glass bottle of water. There was a very little similarity between the two, so even though the bottle of water might have weighed 2 pounds, when I tried to lift the chalk, it felt like 60 pounds. The best link I found was a tree branch I had broken in half. After I understood this little piece of sympathy, Ben taught me others, a dozen sympathetic bindings, 100 little tricks for channeling power. Each of them was a different word in a vast vocabulary I was just beginning to speak. Quite often it was tedious, and I'm not telling you the half of it. Ben continued giving me a smattering of lessons in other areas, history, arithmetic, and chemistry. But I grabbed at whatever he could teach me about sympathy. He doled out his secrets sparingly, making me prove I'd master one before giving me another. But I seemed to have a knack for it above and beyond my natural penchant for absorbing knowledge, so there was never too long a wait. I don't mean to imply that the road was always smooth. The same curiosity that made me such an eager student also led me into trouble with fair regularity. One evening, as I was building up my parents' cook fire, my mother caught me chanting a rhyme. I had heard the day before. Not knowing that she was behind me, she overheard as I knocked one stick of firewood against another and absent-mindedly recited, 7 things a lady has lady lackless, keeps them underneath her black dress. 1 a ring that's not for wearing, 1 a sharp word, not for swearing. Right beside her husband's candle, there's a door without a handle. In a box, no lid or locks, lackless keeps her husband's rocks. There's a secret she's been keeping, she's been dreaming and not sleeping. On a road that's not for traveling, lackless likes her riddle raveling. I had heard a little girl chant it as she played hop-skip. I'd only heard it twice, but it had stuck in my head. It was memorable, as most child rhymes are, but my mother heard me and came over to stand by the fire. "What were you just saying, sweet?" Her tone wasn't angry, but I could tell she wasn't pleased either. "Something I heard back in Fallows," I said evasively. Running off with town children was a largely forbidden activity. Distrust turns quickly to dislike, my father told new members of our troop, so stay together when you're in town, and be polite. I laid some heavier sticks on the fire and let the flames lick them. My mother was silent for a while, and I was beginning to hope she would leave it alone when she said, It's not a nice thing to be singing. Have you stopped to think what it's about?" I hadn't actually. It seemed mostly nonsense rhyme, but when I ran it back through my head, I saw the rather obvious sexual innuendos. "I do. I didn't think about it before." Her expression grew a little gentler, and she reached down to smooth my hair. "Always think about what you're singing, honey." I seemed to be out of trouble, but I couldn't keep from asking, How is it any different than parts of For All His Waiting? Like when Fane asked Lady Periel about her hat. I heard about it from so many men, I wished to see it for myself and try the fit. It's pretty obvious that he's really talking about..." I watched her mouth grow firm, not angry, but not pleased. Then something in her face changed. You tell me what the difference is, she said. I hate, I hated bait questions. The difference was obvious. One would get me in trouble, the other wouldn't. I waited a while to make it clear I had given the matter proper consideration before I shook my head. My mother knelt lightly in front of the fire, warming her hands. The difference is, go fetch me the tripod, would you? She gave me a gentle push, and I scampered off to get it from the back of our wagon as she continued. The difference is between saying something to a person and saying something about a person. The first might be rude, but the second is always gossip. I brought the tripod back and helped her set it over the pardon me. I brought the tripod back and helped her set it over the fire. Also, Lady Periel is just a character. Lady Lackless is a real person with feelings that can be hurt. She looked up at me. I didn't know, I protested guiltily. I must have struck a sufficiently piteous figure because she gathered me in for a hug and a kiss. It's nothing to cry over, sweet one. Just remember to always think about what you're doing. She ran her hand over my head and smiled like the sun. I imagine you could make it up to both Lady Lackless and myself if you found some sweet nettle for the pot tonight. Any excuse to escape judgment and play for a while in the tangle of trees by the roadside was good enough for me. I was gone almost before the words left her mouth. I should also make it clear that much of the time I spent with Ben was my free time. I was still responsible for my normal duties in the troupe. I acted the part of the young page when needed. I helped paint scenery and sew costumes. I rubbed down the horses at night and rattled the sheet of the tin backstage when we needed thunder on stage. But I didn't bemoan the loss of my free time. A child's endless energy and my own insatiable lust for knowledge made the following year one of the happiest times I can remember. Chapter 12. Puzzle Pieces Fitting. Toward the end of the summer, I accidentally overheard a conversation that shook me out of my state of blissful ignorance. When we are children, we seldom think of the future. This innocence leaves us free to enjoy ourselves as few adults can. The day we fret about the future is the day we leave our childhood behind. It was evening, and the troop was camped by the side of the road. Abinthy had given me a new piece of sympathy to practice. The maxim of variable heat transferred to constant motion, or something pretentious like that. It was tricky, but it had fallen into place like a puzzle piece fitting. It had taken about 15 minutes, and from Abinthy's tone, I guess he had expected it to take 3 or 4 hours at least. So I went looking for him, partly to get my next lesson, and partly so that I could be just a little bit smug. I tracked him down to my parents' wagon. I heard the three of them long before I saw them. Their voices were just murmurs, the distant music that a conversation makes when it's too dim for words. But as I was coming close, I heard one word clearly. Chandrian. I pulled up short when I heard that. Everyone in the troupe knew my father was working on a song. He'd been teasing old stories and rhymes from townsfolk for over a year wherever we stopped to play. For months, it was stories about Lanra. Then he started gathering old fairy stories too, legends about bogies and shamblemen. Then he began to ask questions about the Chandrian. That was months ago. Over the last half a year, he had asked more about the Chandrian and less about Lanra, Lyra, and the rest. Most songs my father set to writing were finished in a single season, while this one was stretching towards its second year. You should know this as well. My father never let word or whisper of a song be heard before it was ready to play. Only my mother was allowed into his confidence, as her hand was always in any song he made. The cleverness in the music was his. The best words were hers. When you wait a few span or a month to hear a finished song, the anticipation adds savor. But after a year, excitement begins to sour. By now, a year and a half had passed, and folk were almost mad with curiosity. This occasionally led to hard words when someone was caught wandering a little too close to our wagon while my father and mother were working. So I moved closer to my parents' fire, stepping softly. Eavesdropping is a deplorable habit, but I have developed worse ones since. Much about them, I heard Ben say, but I'm willing. I'm glad to talk with an educated man on the subject. My father's strong baritone was a contrast to Ben's tenor. I'm wary of these superstitious country folk, and someone added wood to the fire, and I lost my father's words in the crackling that followed. Stepping as quickly as I dared, I moved into the long shadow of my parents' wagon. Like I'm chasing ghosts with this song, trying to piece together this story is a fool's game. I wish I'd never started it. Nonsense, my mother said. This will be your best work, and you know it. So, you think there's an original story all the others stem from? Ben asked. A historical basis for Lanra. All signs all signs point to it, my father said. It's like looking at a dozen grandchildren and seeing 10 of them have blue eyes. You know the grandmother had blue eyes too. I've done this before and I'm good at it. I wrote Below the Walls the same way, but I heard him sigh. What's the problem then? The story's older, my mother explained. It's more like he's looking at great-great-grandchildren. And they're scattered to the four corners, my father groused. And when I finally do find one, it's got 5 eyes, 2 greens, a blue, a brown, and a chartreuse. Then the next one has only 1 eye, and it changes color. How am I supposed to draw conclusions from that? Ben cleared his throat. A disturbing analogy, he said. But you're welcome to pick my brain about the Chandrian. I've heard a lot of stories over the years. The first thing I need to know is how many there actually are, my father said. Most stories say 7, but even that's conflicted. Some say 3, others 5, and in Felior's Fall, there are a full 13 of them. 1 for each pontifet in Autun, and an extra for the capital. That I can answer, Ben said. 7. You can hold to that with some certainty. It's part of their name, actually. Shan means 7. Shandian means 7 of them. Chandrian. I didn't know that, my father said. Shan. What language is that? Yilish? Sounds like Timmut, my mother said. You've got a good ear, Ben said to her. It's Temic, actually. Predates Timma by about 1,000 years. Well, that simplifies things, I heard my father say. I wish I'd asked you a month ago. I don't suppose you know why they do what they do. I could tell by my father's tone that he didn't really expect an answer. That's the real mystery, isn't it? Ben chuckled. I think that's what makes them more frightening than the rest of the bogeymen you hear about in stories. A ghost wants revenge. A demon wants your soul. A shambleman is hungry and cold. It makes them less terrible. Things we understand we can try to control, but Chandrian come like lightning from a clear blue sky. Just destruction. No rhyme or reason to it. My song will have both, my father said with grim determination. I think I've dug up their reasons. After all this while, I think I've dug up their reasons after all this while. I've teased it together from bits and pieces of story. That's what's so galling about this, to have the hardest part of this done and have all these small specifics giving me such trouble. You think you know, Ben said curiously. What's your theory? My father gave a low chuckle. Oh no, Ben. You'll have to wait with the others. I sweat too long over this song to give away the heart of it before it's finished. I could hear the disappointment in Ben's voice. I'm sure this is all just an elaborate ruse to keep me traveling with you, he groused. I won't be able to leave until I've heard the blackened thing. Then help us finish it, my mother said. The Chandrian sign are another key piece of information we can't nail down. Everyone agrees there are signs that warn of their presence, but nobody agrees on what they are. Let me think, Ben said. Blue flame is obvious, of course, but I'd hesitate to attribute that to the Chandrian in particular. In some stories, it's a sign of demons. In others, it's fey creatures or magic of any sort. It shows bad air in mines, too, my mother pointed out. Does it? My father asked. She nodded. When a lamp burns with a blue haze, you know there's fire damp in the air. Yeah. Good Lord, fire damp in a coal mine, my father said. Blow out your light and get lost in the black, or leave it burn and blow the whole place to flinders. That's more frightening than any demon. I'll also admit to the fact that certain arcanists occasionally use prepared candles or torches to impress gullible townsfolk, Ben said, clearing his throat self-consciously. My mother laughed. Remember who you're talking to, Ben. We'd never hold a little showmanship against a man. In fact, blue candles would be just the thing the next time we play Daonica. If you happen to find a couple tucked away somewhere, that is. I'll see what I can do, Ben said, his voice amused. Other signs? Oh, one of them is supposed to have eyes like a goat, or no eyes, or black eyes. I've heard that one quite a bit. I've heard that plants die when the Chandrian are around. Wood rots, metal rusts, brick crumbles. He paused. Though I don't know if that's several signs or all one sign. You begin to see the trouble I'm having, my father said morosely. And there's still the question as to if they all share the same signs or have a couple each. I told you, my mother said, exasperated. One sign for each of them. It makes the most sense. My lady wife's favorite theory, my father said, but it doesn't fit. In some stories, the only sign is blue flame. In others, you have animals going crazy and no blue flame. In others, you have a man with black eyes and animals going mad and blue flame. I've told you how to make sense of that, she said, her irritated tone indicating they had had this particular discussion before. They don't always have to be together. They could go out in threes or fours. If one of them makes fires dim, then it'll look the same as if they all made the fires dim. They would account for the differences in the stories, different numbers and different signs depending on how they're grouped together. My father grumbled something. That's a clever wife you've got there, Arl. Ben spoke up, breaking the tension. How much will you sell her for? I need her for my work, unfortunately. But if you're interested in a short-term rental, I'm sure we could arrange areas. There was a fleshy thump, followed by a slightly pained chortle in my father's baritone. Any other signs that spring to mind? They're supposed to be cold to the touch, though how anyone could know that is beyond me. I've heard that fires don't burn them, though that directly contradicts the blue flame. It could. The wind picked up, stirring the trees. The rustling leaves drowned out what Ben said. I took advantage of the noise to creep a few steps closer. Being yoked to the shadow, whatever that means, I heard my father say as the wind died down. Ben grunted. I couldn't say either. I heard a story where they were given away because their shadows pointed the wrong way toward the light. And there was another where one of them was referred to as shadow-hamed. It was something the shadow-hamed. Damned if I can't remember the name, though. Speaking of names, that's another point I'm having trouble with, my father said. There are a couple dozen I've collected that I'd appreciate your opinion on. The most... Actually, Arl, Ben interrupted, I'd appreciate it if you didn't say them out loud. Names of people, that is. You can scratch them in the dirt if you'd like, or I could go fetch a slate. But I'd be more comfortable if you didn't actually say any of them. Better safe than sore, as they say. There was a deep piece of silence. I stopped mid-sneak with one foot off the ground, afraid they'd hear me. Now don't go looking at me like that, either of you, Ben said testily. We're just surprised, Ben, came my mother's gentle voice. You don't seem the superstitious type. I'm not, Ben said. I'm careful. There's a difference. Of course, my father said. I'd never save it for the paying customers, Arl. Ben cut him off, irritation plain in his voice. "You're too good an actor to show it, but I know perfectly well when someone thinks I'm daft." I just didn't expect it, Ben, my father said apologetically. "You're educated, and I'm so tired of people touching iron and tipping their beer as soon as I mention the Chandrian. I'm just reconstructing a story, not meddling with dark arts." "Well, hear me out. I like both of you too well to let you think of me as an old fool," Ben said. "Besides, I have something to talk with you about later, and I'll need you to take me seriously for that." The wind continued to pick up, and I used the noise to cover my last few steps. I edged around the corner of my parents' wagon and peered through a veil of leaves. The three of them were sitting around the campfire. Ben was sitting on a stump, huddled in his frayed brown cloak. My parents were opposite of him, my mother leaning against my father, a blanket draped loosely around them. Ben poured from a clay jug into a leather mug and handed it to my mother. His breath fogged as he spoke. "How do they feel about demons, often Atur?" he asked. "Scared," my father tapped his temple. "All that religion makes their brains soft." "How about often Ventus?" Ben asked. "Fair number of them in Talons. Do they feel the same way?" My mother shook her head. "They think it's all silly. They th- they like their demons metaphorical." "What are they afraid of at night in Ventus then?" "The Fae," my mother said. My father spoke at the same time. "Draugr." "You're both right, depending on which part of the country you're in," Ben said. "And here in the Commonwealth, people laugh up their sleeves at both ideas." He gestured at the surrounding trees. "But here they're careful come autumn time for fear of drawing the attention of shamblemen." That's the way of things," my father said. "Half of being a good trooper is knowing which way your audience leans." "You still think I've gone cracked in the head," Ben said, amused. "Listen, if tomorrow we pulled into Biren and someone told you there were shamblemen in the woods, would you believe them?" My father shook his head. "What if two people told you?" Another shake. Ben leaned forward on his stump. "What if a dozen people told you, with perfect earnestness, that shamblemen were out in the fields, eating?" "Of course I wouldn't believe them," my father said, irritated. "It's ridiculous." "Of course it is," Ben agreed, raising a finger. "But the real question is this. Would you go into the woods?" My father sat very still and thought for a moment. Ben nodded. "You'd be a fool to ignore half the town's warning, even though you don't believe the same thing they do. If not shamblemen, what are they afraid of?" "Bears." "Bandits." "Good sensible fears for a trooper to have," Ben said. "Fears that townsfolk don't appreciate. Every place has its little superstitions, and everyone laughs at what the folk across the river think." He gave them a serious look. "But have either of you ever heard of humorous songs or story about the Chandrian?" "I'll bet a penny you haven't." My mother shook her head after a moment's thought. My father took a long drink before joining her. "Now, I'm not saying that the Chandrian are out there, striking like lightning from the clear blue sky, but folk everywhere are afraid of them. There's usually a reason for that." Ben grinned and tipped his clay cup, pouring the last drizzle of beer out onto the earth. "And names are strange things, dangerous things." He gave them a pointed look. "That I know for true because I am an educated man. If I'm a mite superstitious too," he shrugged, "well, that's my choice. I'm old. You have to humor me." My father nodded thoughtfully. "It's odd I never noticed that everyone treats the Chandrian the same. It's something I should have seen." He shook his head as if to clear it. "We can come back to names later, I suppose. What was it you wanted to talk about?" I prepared to sneak off before I was caught, but what Ben said next froze me in place before I took a single step. "It's probably hard to see, being his parents and all, but your young Gavoth is rather bright." Ben refilled his cup and held out the jug to my father, who declined it. "As a matter of fact, bright doesn't begin to cover it, not by half." My mother watched Ben over the top of her mug. Anyone who spends a little time with the boy can see that, Ben. I don't see why anyone would make a point of it, least of all you. I don't think you really grasp the situation, Ben said, stretching his feet almost into the fire. How easily did he pick up the loot? My father seemed a little surprised by the sudden change of topic. Fairly easily. Why? How old was he? My father tugged thoughtfully at his beard for a moment. In the silence, my mother's voice was like a flute. 8. Think back to when you learned to play. Can you remember how old you were? Can you remember the sort of difficulties you had? My father continued to tug on his beard, but his face was more reflective now, his eyes far away. Abinthy continued, I'll bet he learned each chord, each fingering after being shown just once. No stumbling, no complaining. And when he did make a mistake, it was never more than once, right? My father seemed a little perturbed. Mostly, but he did have trouble. Just the same as anyone else. E chord. He had a lot of trouble with greater and diminished E. My mother broke in softly. I remember too, dear, but I think it was just his small hands. He was awfully young. I bet it didn't stall him for long, Ben said quietly. He does have marvelous hands. My mother would have called them magician's fingers. My father smiled. He gets them from his mother, delicate but strong. Perfect for scrubbing pots, eh, woman? My mother swatted him, then caught one of his hands in her own and unfolded it for Ben to see. He gets them from his father, graceful and gentle, perfect for seducing young nobles' daughters. My father started to protest, but she ignored him. With his eyes and those hands, there won't be a woman safe in all of the world when he starts hunting after the ladies. Courting, dear, my father corrected gently. Semantics, she shrugged. It's all a chase, and when the race is done, I think I pity women chaste who run. She leaned back against my father, keeping his hand in her lap. She tilted her head slightly, and he took his cue, leaning in to kiss the corner of her mouth. Amen, Ben said, raising his mug in salute. My father put his other arm around her and gave her a squeeze. I still don't see what you're getting at, Ben. He does everything that way, quick as a whip, hardly ever makes mistakes. I'll bet he knows every song you've ever sung to him. He knows more about what's in my wagon than I do. He picked up the jug and uncorked it. It's not just memorization, though. He understands. Half the things I've been meaning to show him, he's already figured out for himself. Ben refilled my mother's cup. He's 11. Have you ever known a boy his age who talks the way he does? A great deal of it comes from living in such an enlightened atmosphere. Ben gestured to the wagons. But most 11-year-olds' deepest thoughts have to do with skipping stones and how to swing a cat by the tail. God. My mother laughed like bells, but Abinthy's face was serious. It's true, lady. I've had older students that would have loved to do half as well, he grinned. If I had had his hands and 1/4 of his wit, I'd be eating off silver plates inside a year. There was a lull. My mother spoke softly. I remember when he was just a little boy, just a little baby, toddling around, watching, always watching, with clear, bright eyes that looked like they wanted to swallow up the world. Her voice had a little quiver in it. My father put his arm around her and she rested her head on his chest. The next silence was longer. I was considering sneaking away when my father broke it. What is it you suggest we do? His voice was a mix of mild concern and fatherly pride. Ben smiled gently. Nothing except to think about what options you might give him when the time comes. He will leave his mark on the world as one of the best. The best what? My father rumbled. Whatever he chooses. If he stays here, I don't doubt he will become the next Ilian. My father smiled. Ilian is the trooper's hero, the only truly famous Adimaru in all of history. All of our oldest, best songs are his songs. What's more, if you believe the stories, Ilian reinvented the lute in his lifetime. A master luthier, Ilian transformed the archaic, fragile, unwieldy court lute into the marvelous, versatile, 7-string trooper's lute we use today. The same stories claim Ilian's own lute had 8 strings in all. Ilian, I like that thought, my mother said. Kings coming from miles away to hear my little Kavoth play. His music stopping barroom brawls and border wars, Ben smiled. The wild women in his lap, my father enthused, laying their breast on his head. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then my mother spoke slowly with an edge to her voice. I think you mean wild beasts laying their heads in his lap. Do I? Ben coughed and continued. If he decides to become an arcanist, I bet he'll have a royal appointment by the time he's 24. If he gets into his head to be a merchant, I don't doubt he'll own half the world by the time he dies. My father's brow knitted together. Ben smiled and said, Don't worry about the last one. He's too curious for a merchant. Ben paused as if considering the next words very carefully. He'd be accepted into the university, you know. Not for years, of course. 17 is about as young as they go, but I have no doubts about it. I missed the rest of what Ben said. The university. I had come to think of it in the same way most children think of the Fae Court, a mystical place reserved for dreaming about. A school the size of a small town, 10 times 10,000 books, people who would know the answers to any question I could ever ask. It was quiet when I turned my attention back to them. My father was looking down at my mother, nestled under his arm. How about it, woman? Did you happen to bed down with some wandering god a dozen years ago? That might solve our little mystery. She swatted at him playfully, and a thoughtful look crossed her face. Come to think of it, there was a night about a dozen years ago. A man came to me. He bound me with kisses and chords of chorded song. He robbed me of my virtue and stole me away, she paused. But he didn't have red hair. Couldn't be him. She smiled wickedly at my father, who appeared a little embarrassed. Then she kissed him. He kissed her back. That's how I like to remember them today. I snuck away with thoughts of the university dancing in my head. Well, I'm going to stop there for the day. If you joined me, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you dropping in. If you're listening in the future, I hope you are enjoying what I'm doing. We're going to pick up next time with chapter 13, which is called Interlude, Flesh with Blood Beneath. Other than that, I don't have much to say. Of course, if you've watched the other videos that I've done, you know I do a podcast with my band called Bombarded. My bandmates, they all play bards. They bring their instruments to the table. They play their magic spells. Sorry, reading takes it out of me. They play their spells. You know, they just take, you know, a popular song or a song that we like, and they'll change up the words or whatever to make it work for the spell. And every episode, we wind up rolling 8-sided dice that have chords on them, and we take those chords and we write a song. So if you're here and you don't know about Bombarded and you want to find a D&D musical-ish podcast, go check it out. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to, you know, talk about it on any social media, you can find us using the handle @BombardedCast. And if you just want to talk to people about the podcast, check out the hashtag Bardcast. A lot of people are putting like fan art and theories up there, and that's overall social media. There's probably some I haven't seen just because I don't have my fingers in all those pies, but I'm trying, doing what I can. So thank you again for joining me. Dylan, thanks for kicking it off with a good hi. I appreciate that. That starts my day off well. And catch y'all next time.